Hello friends, it's Kat from Meow Kapow. Last week, I watched a single video of someone doing embroidery by hand and immediately decided it was something I needed to try, but like most hobbies I start on a whim, I didn't really research how to do it. The closest I've ever come to embroidering something is probably the mouth of this giant bat pillow I made a few years ago, and I think we can agree that calling it embroidery is quite a generous stretch. Today we're going to find out if you can learn how to do embroidery by using this $6 embroidery kit I got on Amazon. It's in the doobly-doo if you want to get your own. From the description, it seemed like aside from a pair of scissors, it included everything you needed. But I quickly found out that you actually also need to provide an embroidery hoop that you can actually work on, since the backings for these mini hoops are solid, meaning they're for display rather than for working your needle through. No worries, I went a little nuts on this embroidery thing like I always do, and got a couple of hoops on my own from Michael's. They were like $2 each, so it's not that big of a deal. The two patterns you can choose from are a bird and a bee and... Oh my gosh, sorry for the total smut. I guess this video is PG-13. Definitely did not think about that when I got this kit. I really just wanted to make the cute little bee. Oh boy. Subscribe if you noticed that way before I did. Anyway, I wanted to make the little bee first, and looking through the instructions, I immediately realized that they were not super helpful. Certain parts made sense to me, like the chart on the back that says which stitch is which, how to do it, and how many threads of which color you need. But the instructions on the front were a little confusing for me, and I ended up ignoring half of them and just doing what I figured would work regardless of whether or not it was right. For instance, the first thing the kit tells us to do is overcast the edges of the fabric with our own sewing thread, but I have no idea what that means, so I just skipped it. It also tells us that to start our thread, we need to hold an inch of thread behind the fabric and secure it by working the first several stitches over it. But I didn't understand how that would work and how the thread would stay on the needle, so I just folded the thread in half and tied a knot in the end and worked from that. It worked out okay, so I don't really see anything wrong with it. Also, this is something I knew from the one video I watched, but embroidery thread is made out of multiple pieces of smaller thread twisted together, and you're supposed to separate the threads and only use a couple at a time rather than all 6, so that... Well, I don't really know why, actually. I assume it's so the stitches aren't overly bulky? If you're into embroidery, would you kindly throw down some knowledge in the comments section? The one instruction that the front gave that I followed easily was that the working order said to start with the satin stitches. When you look at the chart on the back, it shows you which stitches are the satin stitches, so it's easy to follow. I also found the diagrams and description of how to perform each of the stitches needed for these projects super easy to follow, so that was helpful. However, one thing about the way these patterns were set up kind of bothered me while I was working on them. There were lines on the fabric that told you the direction that your stitches should be going in. However, in some instances, that direction didn't really seem to make sense. Mostly, when there was a curved area to work from, it would tell me to embroider straight across the curve and basically erase that curved shape as a result. The stripes on the bee's body were meant to be curved a bit more, and they're really just straight horizontal stripes instead. It was also strange that once I got to the wings, there were supposed to be 2 distinct wings on each side, but the direction of the thread made it so they essentially look like one instead. Still, I'm surprised that this came out as well as it did, especially for it being my first time even trying this. When it came time to finish, I realized that in order to cut out the bee that I'd been working on, I needed to first finish the bird because the hoop I was using to work from wouldn't have enough fabric to grip onto and stretch if I cut out the bee first. So, onto the bird. The bird was slightly more complicated in that it included lazy daisy stitches and a French knot as well, whereas the bee was entirely satin stitches and back stitches. I'd say that doing the bee first was likely the right choice just because it was simpler in what needed to be done. I found that as I went on continuing this pattern, it got easier and easier to work with. I started to feel more confident in my stitching, and even if it's a little bit wonkier in some places, and even if the instructions pretty much confused me halfway from the start, it ended up making sense once I physically had to make it. Despite what flaws I feel may have been in the initial instructions, I think it really came through for us when it came to both the instructions and diagrams of how to make the 4 specific stitches we needed to complete both projects. It also did a good job of making the whole thing approachable by only including 4 different types of stitches. From a beginner's point of view, I think this is a pretty good kit to start off with since it really isn't overly complex, and the small size of both designs means it will only take you a couple of hours total if you're as slow as me, which isn't an intimidating amount of time to spend on a cute and delightfully relaxing project. So, to finish, I cut out the designs just outside of the area that was marked on the fabric and centered it on the solid backing piece of the hoop. Then I did a sort of loose hand stitch around the circumference of the fabric, which I planned to pull tight to keep the extra fabric flat. Before pulling that tight, I decided to use some of this fabric glue and make a sort of ring around the inside of the wooden disc so that the tightened up fabric edges would stay down, and that worked out pretty well. I think that the stitch I used to make that tightening is technically known as a basting stitch, but it's usually meant to be temporary. All you have to do is sort of weave in and out of the fabric in a line, and when you're ready to tighten it, just pull one of the ends. It sort of looks like a tiny dice bag. The instructions themselves actually recommended covering the back with some extra fabric to hide all of the loose ends and whatnot, so I also used some of the leftovers, cut a circle that was slightly smaller than the inside of the outer ring of the mini hoop, and used more glue to secure it down onto the backing. Then I also added a ring of glue around the outside edge of the piece itself, since it doesn't actually stay inside of the hoop on its own because for whatever reason they made this far too loose to actually stay. There were a lot of things about this kit that made me want to not like it, like the string holder that it came with is garbage and knotted up and not at all useful for storing the threads since they all end up on top of one another in a total mishmash. I also didn't want to like it because I got frustrated reading the instructions initially, but I've already talked about how I feel like it redeemed itself anyway. And I wanted to be upset with it because I didn't realize that the hoops it came with were purely for display and not able to be used to work on, and they didn't even fit tightly around the finished piece, but realistically, I fixed all of my problems with this kit with a $2 embroidery hoop I'd already gotten and some fabric glue I already had. So in the end, I actually really liked it. The designs were super cute, and the finished projects are way better than I expected my abilities to be because while I have some basic sewing knowledge, I had no real idea how to embroider before this. And I have to admit, I now feel like I have enough basic skills to make a project on my own if I wanted to, or to start another kit with a more advanced or larger design, since this really was a great introduction to the craft. Let me know in the comments what you would have changed to make this kit a bit better, or if you have a recommendation for patterns or kits to use to start learning. I have a couple more that I'll be giving a shot, so hopefully this was a great way for me to start. If you've done this kit, let me know what your impressions of it were too. Until I see you next time, I wish you peace, love, and backstitching. Bye!